The only part and I had to do with that was because of my experience with the infrared being too long and making the image too big. With the ultraviolet, it was a lousy scheme because it made the mat too small, which had to be enlarged. And furthermore, everybody on the set, the eyes would fluoresce inside the eyeball, and it was very uncomfortable. And it also had the problems that you couldn't walk on the screen or get close to it. So it was a workable system with lots of limitations. But the only part I played was that I got together with the screen maker, the people who made the screens, and they were having difficulties measuring their dispersion. And so I built a goniophotometer, that's what it's called. I built two of them, one for me at the research center and one for him at the factory. And so he would make a test and send me the test, and I'd use mine to measure the same sample, and we'd get exactly the same results. And year after year we'd check each other. It was 100% matches, so he knew his instrument was always good. The ultraviolet was too short and the infrared was too long in making too small and too large mats. I said, why don't I go right into the middle of the visible spectrum? And there I found a double line, which is the sodium line. And it's only less than a millimicron wide. And so I said, well, now if I can split that off, then I would have a perfect mat. And there was a couple of guys out in the valley here that had left Technicolor to go into business for themselves, and they did multi-layer coating. And so they took one of the prisms in the Technicolor camera, and they coated it to select that sodium line and reflect it off to a black and white film. And you know, it took them, I get 6 or 8 tries. And they ended up with 41 layers, shaded to be thinner on the edges and thicker in the center, or vice versa, so that they get the same intensity. And they succeeded to make a filter that reflected over 80% of the sodium vapor light and literally didn't remove 1% from the visible light. And so in that black and white film, you had a perfect mat. The only problem was you can't walk into the scene. It always has to be a kind of a big window. Otherwise, it was a good system. I found out much later that a guy in England was already doing the sodium thing, but they didn't have a prism, and they had to lose 2 stops of light. Now, 2 stops of light is a big loss. And but with my filter, you didn't do anything. You used your regular lights. You didn't have anything to filter, and so you just got up and photographed, because all the filtering was done in the prism. The straight-through light was color. The reflected off sodium was a black and white mat, and there you had your mat ready made in the camera, and it was perfect. And like I say, you couldn't get into the scene like walking on the floor or whatnot, because they had to be separated from each other. And so that was I might say a defect, but on the other hand, you got excellent results. Right. And so after I got the prism, I said, well, now, these guys came from Technicolor, so I called Technicolor, and they loaned me a camera. And then I called up the Department of Water and Power, and they loaned me a bunch of street lights, and they delivered them. I decided to do the test at 20th Century Fox, because they were interested. And the subject was an airplane, as a fighter aircraft with lots of glass and transparencies, and those kinds of shots nobody would ever attempt to shoot. So we saw them a week later, and it's beautiful. And I got a patent. It was issued. And so then, of course, having proved that I can do it, that's open now to the entire motion picture industry, that they wanted or not. Well, Works was there, and he wanted it. And so I said, okay. I said, I had to pay those guys that made the prism $700. So you got to give a research center a check for $700. Call up Technicolor and see if they'll loan you the camera, and call up Department of Water and Power, see if they'll transfer the loan on the lights. And I said, then you're set up. So he did that, and they started making pictures. And he went out to these young guys to see if they would make him a prism, and they said yes, $3,000. Well, consider all the work that they put in, and to do 41 layers and to get them all exactly right, it's worth $3,000. And they hope to get back all their development costs. And my $700 was trivial. They just wanted to get in and make this prism. And so he said, that's ridiculous. He says, that's highway robbery. I'm not going to do it. And so he went the way of the people in England. He lost 2 steps of light. And you have to make up, that's a lot of light to lose. And then he had to put filters on every lamp, and had to put other prisms inside the camera. So it's he made it work, of course, but he lost a lot of light, and he had to do a lot of filtering on every light on the set. Just because he wouldn't spend the $3,000 to buy a filter. They were going to make a 70mm picture, and you know, Paramount had already made one, and they had terrible trouble. They worked 7 months around the clock, three crews trying to do the matte shots. And that was where you photograph the whole scene, including the blue screen, and then use a very high black and white film with a high black density. And this they would use then to block out everything in around the blue screen and just leave the subject. And you could put the subject in, and then you cover the subject then by making a reverse matte, and then that allows you then to put in the background scene. But you come up to an edge, and you always saw a little blue line. So you have to then remake the matte a little and stretch it out a little bit, and try to cover up that little space. Now, if you moved, then you had a bigger problem, and if you moved rapidly, you had a big problem. And it was always visible that it was a poor composite. It never looked right. You could detect it so simply. On the other hand, the other blue screen, the one that I invented, you can't tell. And you look today, after I made an electronic form of it, and I can't tell if it's a composite or not. At any rate, Doug Shearer, who was their head man out there, he was, by the way, a first-rate scientist. And he said, we can't use the 70mm film because, he said, your system, the sodium, because there are no 70mm dual film cameras. There aren't any. There's all the cameras that'll handle 2 films are 35mm. So he says, can you do something for us? And I said, I'll try. I said, well, you know what you're asking me? I said, people have been trying for years, and the best people in the industry, and they have never made any advance. And I said, the probability is I won't either, but I'll have a good look at it. And it took a long time to it took a long time to be conscious of the fact that you just simply can't use the blue separation. And when you photograph a scene, you have red, blue, and green. And the blue includes the blue screen. Well, how do you get rid of it? You never do, right around the edges, because people move and they have loose hair. And I said, you have to get rid of all of that, and you black it out. And I said, I think in some cases it even did some handwork. And so that was not a system that was viable, really. But people used it in spite of the fact. So I said to Doug, I'll give it a try. And I realized I could not use the blue separation. And so I did something unthinkable. I took the green separation and printed it with blue light. Now, what did that give me? Well, grayscales look good. Anything gray from white to black look good. Flesh tones, since the blue and green are equal, look great. Green turned cyan, too much green. And so I thought, well, who cares? Nobody knows what the color was anyway. So you could use cyan. So I said, I've got a pretty good system here. But I thought to myself, but it's not perfect. And so I spent another week. By the way, I'm talking now 6 months later. For 6 months I've been staring at this thing. And then it hit me that I just couldn't use the blue backing. Don't photograph it. And I didn't. And so then I said, now I've got a good looking system, but the colors are wrong. And so I got the original negative again and looked at it, and with blue light, and I saw 3 little spots. That light came through. And I said, wow, they're coming through the 3 places where I got too much blue. And so I printed that to make me a mask, and it masks only the spots where I had too much blue. Now I've got all the colors back to normal. And I called up Doug Shearer. I said, Doug, I've got a system that's going to solve your problem. I said, you can use any camera. And I said, any of your lights, your standard lights, standard cameras, standard film. And I said, you can walk on the screen, and I said, you can have smoke or the mist or in the air. You can throw things back and forth at high speed. You can flip your hand up and down. And I said, everything is normal like you expect it to be. And I said, but that's all in my head. But it's going to work exactly like I'm telling you. So he says, well, come on out and test it. I had to go out to MGM, and here's their man that does the mat work, and whose name will come to me eventually. And he said, I said, I was going to come out and show you a new way to do traveling mat. Well, he was the best guy in the industry already. And he kind of laughed and said, okay, what are you going to do? So I explained it to him in good detail, how to make the mats, and no more high contrast. Everything is low contrast. Otherwise you can't get transparencies. And so then he said, okay, let's go out on the stage. We go out on the stage, and here's one wall all blue. And he sees the guy over there, and he says, Glenn, come on over. Well, Glenn walked over, and that was Glenn Ford. He was doing a Western. And he says, sit on that stool there. And he says, light up a cigar. And Glenn laughed because he knows you can't net smoke. So he got up there and he says, and started to light his smoke, and got smoke, and he says, now do a few puffs. And he said, oh, that's enough. He says, we got our test made. And he called me about a week later and says, come on out and take a look. I go out and take a look, and here's Glenn Ford sitting on the stool. Behind him is a beautiful desert scene. And here he is puffing his smoke, and you can see the smoke, and you can see through the smoke to the desert scene. Not a sign of blue anywhere. The technician there said, I'm going to make some more tests. And what he did was he took all 17 shots, spliced them together, run them through, and the management happened to see them, and he said, oh, those are the finest mats we've ever seen anybody make. Put them in the movie, put them in the film, don't touch them. And that's what happened. And so they did all the scenes on that one test. But Ben-Hur, of course, did a lot of scenes with horses and riding, and a lot of fast motion, I might add. Sure. But it worked like a charm. That first Oscar was, I guess, the It was. It was for the film system that lets you have transparencies in your subject. I had developed that, and we did the picture where Ben-Hur was used with it. And about that time, the company fired everybody they could, and that included me. And I went out to a place in Santa Monica, got a job there. And it was about 2 years later that I got a call from the Academy saying they're going to give an Oscar to iWorks of Disney and one to this guy in Technicolor. And he says, I brought up the fact that they should give one to the inventor. So I showed up at the next meeting, and I said, well, I don't know what UB's doing here, because he had nothing to do with the blue screen. And I said, as far as the sodium system is concerned, he didn't invent it, I did. And I didn't really invent it. Some guy in England actually invented the thing, but although he didn't think of using a prism, so he's 2 stops of light lower. So I guess my invention would cover the 2 stops you came back, and no filters anywhere. But I said, he built smaller cameras, but he didn't change anything, and as far as I can say, he didn't invent anything. And I said, as far as this guy at Technicolor, and I wish I could remember his name, at any rate, he was one of their chief bugs there, and I went out and taught him how to use the blue screen system. And so he started doing it for the studios. And 2 years later, he got real good at it, of course. And so I said, what did you do? And he said, well, I had a patent on some little change or something. And I said, they're not using it at MGM. I says, I don't believe it has any worth for an Oscar. And I said, and I am the only inventor. Well, they gave him Oscars anyway. All 3 of us got the same Oscar. And I think the problem was that both of them are powerful men. iWorks and the guy from Technicolor. And I would be, today, I would have handled it differently. I would have said, well, yes, I think iWorks deserves an award, a Class 3. That's a certificate you hang on the wall. And a Class 3. Now I said, if you argue with these guys, maybe a Class 2, because they should settle for that. But certainly, they didn't invent anything. And the inventor, can you know how big a step that would be to invent from the kind of system you've had to the kind of system we have? And that was me, not these guys. So I said, I don't take the Oscar, and you give these guys something lesser. That's what I should have said. But when you get older, you get tougher. When you're younger, you're not so tough. The people who made movies says, we're going to take the strike. And those who made contracts with the television people says, we have contracts, we can't afford to take a strike. We're going to have to go along with the union. They said, because otherwise we've got big problems and we'll violate all of our contracts. So they decided to split it up into 2 groups, the motion picture group and the television group. And as a result of the split up, they had to save money. And so they got rid of everything that they could. They got rid of central casting. They got rid of the research council, that was us. And what little cost that was to them. And then here I am out on the street, 60 years old, no job. And here walks in Gottschalk. And of course he'd come in a lot of times to see our chemist because they knew each other. And he said, why don't we form a company? He said, I'll provide the money and you provide the engineering. And I said, okay, but here's the problem. before you can invent something and to get it developed and get it to where you're marketing it and making money, it could take as long as 5 years. He said, well, okay. And so we got one of these garages as our first office and factory. And we started to, I started looking at what could we do. And I thought, well, the film system that I had developed was so touchy, and you had to go through so lengthy. You had to make separations, and you had to make a cover mat for that, and you got good results, but we can do better in electronics. And so I said, okay, let us do for the television industry what we did for the motion picture industry. But in the meantime, my electronics was vacuum tubes. And here we were, and nobody used a vacuum tube anymore or knew what one was. It was all little chips, transistors actually, and some minor little chips. And I thought, well, I don't know this electronics. I couldn't design anything. But everything you design has functions. And every little part does some function. So I'm going to make little block diagrams, and I'll write in the function. And then we will hire a guy that knows circuitry and can sit down and produce the function that I specified. And that should work well. So we did hire a guy, and he did come in. First thing he did, he bought a lot of equipment. That was nice. And I would make little segments with the block diagrams, and he would build the little boards to test. And because I was now trying to design the first Ultimate, and I was having problems because I couldn't do the design. I had to depend on somebody else. So I got some books. I learned about at home at night. I learned about transistors and operational amplifiers. And if you've got transistors and operational amplifiers, you can build anything because they're stable, operational amplifiers. And you can multiply, add, subtract, make cutoffs. And so I made a little diagram and handed it to, I forgot his name, but it'll come, to make up the board. And he made it up, and he says, and I tested, it doesn't work. And I said, would you have another look at this? And he picked up the board, looked at it, and says, oh, it's fine. He says, bad design. And so I sat down and wired up the parts because I knew how to do it. And I put it up, and it worked like a charm. And I said, you're fired. And it turned out, I found out later, that he said by having nothing on paper, they would have to depend on him, and he could command any salary he wanted. That was his. And so by making something not work, he could stretch that out. And in the meantime, I had learned electronics. And so now I started designing the Ultimate, and first what I designed was #1, and had about 4 knobs and switches. It worked, but not well. And then I made #2, Ultimate 2, and this time I had about 8 to 12 knobs and switches. And it worked better, but not good enough. So then I made Ultimate 3, and I did a more careful design, and because I was learning at the same time. And this one worked great, except that I wanted to add another feature, because when we were doing a picture at Paramount, and I brought it in, and it sure worked well. They were just tickled about it. And then it come noon time, and they had benches where you're supposed to take off your shoes, but nobody did. They got on, and the whole floor was now dirty with footprints, and they had to repaint. And so I said, that's ridiculous. And so I went back and made a little box with some circuitry, and so the next day when they started to paint, I said, hold it up a minute. I said, watch this. And so I turned the little knob, and the floor would instantly clean. I called it the cleanup circuit. And then I said, I want to put this to the next one. So I built an Ultimat 4, and with cleanup. And that's the one that we built 5. We rented those all over the country as a source of income while we were continuing our design. Oh, the production of the 4 was, well, we intended it for film originally. Right. And we did some work in that respect, but then they weren't ready, really. But TV was. Right. And they were using chroma key, which is like the old style film system. It always had bad edges. It was a switch also. And you can't switch between background and foreground. They're a mesh. At any rate, we thought we would just lease these out. But then most picture people thought that was great, but the TV people said, no, we don't want to lease, we want to buy it, because we're going to put it in and use it. And so we said, okay, so we started selling the Ultimat 4. We had Ultimat, and you had to feed it red, blue, green. And now there's a lot of cameras that didn't give you red, blue, green, they just gave you a finished picture. And so I thought to myself, well, wouldn't it be great if I could make an Ultimat that just used the output of a standard camera? And they said, well, you can't do that. Everybody said, you can't do that. And I said, well, I'm going to see if I can do that. And to me, theoretically, it was possible. So I sat down and built one. And it worked like a charm. So we made those and sold them to the television stations. Newsmat. Because I guess they used it for doing the news. And we made those for quite a long time, the 5. That was the first departure from the analog. And we did the digital one, and I designed the circuitry on it. And that's the last unit that I designed. That we did. There was a 6 and a 7 and an 8 and a 9 and a 10, but 5 was our first one, and I got a patent on it. With the Ultimat 5, that was about the end of my. Yeah. That's when I retired and went up north.